everybody, and welcome back to A Court of Words and Pages. My name is Natalie. So today I'm bringing you guys my February TBR. I'm so happy and excited to be filming videos again after I took pretty much all of February off. I was in a bit of a life slump for most of it, and then last week when I finally wanted to start filming videos again, I had my wisdom teeth out so I couldn't really talk again, but I'm doing much better and I'm ready to film again. So February was like an okay reading month. I read 8 books and I DNF'd 2. So it wasn't my best reading month stat-wise, but I did read a lot of books I enjoyed. Starting off, the first book I finished this month was These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This was a book that I've been really excited to read about ever since I heard about it last November when it was being released, and I finally randomly picked it up one day and I absolutely adored it. So These Violent Delights is set in 1920s Shanghai, China, and we're following Roma and Juliet, who are heirs to rival gangs and also ex-lovers. The two have to team up after a plague starts running rampage through the streets of Shanghai, making people rip out their throats. Roma and Juliet have to figure out what's causing this plague so they can stop it and save their city. So this book was just so incredible. The character work of Roma and Juliet were absolutely fabulous. I feel like I knew both of them and could understand where both sides were coming from, and it was really interesting learning about what happened in the past that made them enemies again today. Something that I wasn't expecting is while this book is told in third person, we don't just follow Roma and Juliet, we follow their cast of friends who are also members of the two rival gangs. So not only through Roma and Juliet do we see the interactions between the two gangs, but also through their friends. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but this book is a Romeo and Juliet retelling. While Romeo and Juliet is not a play that I particularly enjoyed, I really think that Chloe Gong did a good job working from the source material, and I think that my main complaint with the play is like how naive the characters are in it, and that really wasn't a problem in These Violent Delights. Something else I liked about this book was how the fantasy aspect was kind of subtle. Really, the only fantasy we saw in this book was the mystery of the plague and kind of the monster surrounding that, and I think it was really well done. I gave this book 5 stars and I really enjoyed it as my first read of the month. The next book, however, I tried to read, I unfortunately did DNF, and that was The Regans by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page. The Ravens is centered around a sorority at a college that is actually a cover-up for a coven of witches. In the book, we're following 2 characters, one who is looking to become the head of the sorority and another who is a freshman looking to pledge at the sorority, and we follow them as like a mystery starts surrounding and they have to come together to save the secret of the sorority, except they really don't like each other. I got about 100 pages into this book before I realized it really just wasn't doing it for me. I wasn't interested in it and I should just DNF it. I felt like I did not really understand the characters or their motivations that much, and even the ones I did not care about them. The plot was like kind of interesting and the one thing that kept me going as long as it did, but even then I wasn't totally interested in it. The main reason I decided to DNF is something I can't really talk about because I think it would be a spoiler, but there was just one particular plot thread that seemed to be going in a certain direction, and it happened to be one of my least favorite tropes, and I decided, you know what, I'm not going to stick around to see this because I know this is just going to cause me to hate the book, so I'm just going to DNF it. Next up, I read another book that I was really excited to read, and that was Toward Zero by Agatha Christie. So Toward Zero, at the beginning, we're following 3 different random plot lines that really seem to not be connected. We have a failed attempt at a suicide, an accusation of theft against a girl, and the love life of a famous tennis player. And these events are random, but then a murder happens at a family home, and somehow they're all going to become connected. So this definitely was not my favorite Agatha Christie book I've ever read. I think I preferred her Pro series because something that I felt like I lacked in this was I just didn't feel a connection with any of the characters. I think part of this is because I'm so used to reading the Hercule Poirot series where you're really following the detective Hercule Poirot, and he's the main focus of the story, so you already know him, you know all of his character traits. While in this book, Superintendent Battle, who is the detective, you're not really following him. He's just there trying to solve the mystery. The main people you are following are like the suspects of the murder, and they were all finely developed, but I really didn't care for any of them, and I tended not to really like any of them, but I think that was kind of intentional because they're all pretty unlikable characters. I think the mystery in this book was exceptionally well. I always find Agatha Christie's mystery and what happened to be really clever. I think she was a really smart writer, and this book was definitely no exception. It just wasn't my favorite of hers, and it didn't really blow me away, so I gave it 3.5 stars. Next up was another book that I absolutely loved, and that was The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. So I've been really excited to read this book, and I couldn't exactly tell you why, except for when I started reading, I absolutely loved it. So in the Da Vinci Code, we follow Robert Langdon, who is a symbologist at heart, and one night he finds out that the curator of the Louvre has been murdered, and it turns out that the curator was part of the Priory of the Sign, an ancient organization that is protecting a secret, and Langdon has to go across Europe with the help of Sophie Neveu, who is the niece of the curator, to figure out what the secret is and protect it from some people who want to expose it. So this book was amazing. The first 50 or so pages of it were a bit slow, and I had a bit of trouble getting into it, which was expected, but once you really got into the plot, I loved it. So one of the reasons I was really excited to read this book was because I thought it was going to be a lot like National Treasure, with kind of clues hidden in historical objects, and that was absolutely what we had. Not only from the Mona Lisa, as is shown on the cover, but also from different works of Da Vinci and a lot of things surrounding the church. So I think that kind of the hunt and mystery in this book was really good, and it was very fast-paced, kept me flipping, kept me moving pages. I planned really to finish this book. I was going to read 50 more pages this one night and finish it in the morning, and I just stayed up all night reading it because I had to know what happened. Something I wasn't expecting this was also the connection I felt towards the characters. We follow a couple of characters, I think 3 in total, and obviously we follow Langdon, and we follow 2 others that I'm not going to talk about because they're not talked about really on the dust jacket of the book. I think the Da Vinci Code did a really good job at using historical groundwork, and it gets you thinking that, yeah, some of the stuff it's suggesting could absolutely be true, but we just don't know because it's one of history's mysteries. Something that it talks about is symbols and their meanings, because symbols are used a lot through this treasure hunt, and Langdon is a symbologist, so he knows a lot about them, so that's something that's talked about a lot, and I learned a lot of new information, and this book was just really fast-paced, a lot of fun, and I gave it 5 stars again. The next book I read was my continuation of the reread of the Raven Boys series, and that was Blue Lily Lily Blue by Maggie Stiefvater. So I never really know how to describe the Raven Boys, but the best I can give you is we're following these 4 boys known as the Raven Boys: Gansey, Adam, Noah, Ronan, and then their friend that they meet, Blue, as they're trying to find a dead Welsh king. I feel like I don't really want to tell you more about that because part of the magic of this book is discovering what the plot is and seeing kind of where things go from that. Blue Lily Lily Blue is the 3rd book in the series and one of my favorites. It's probably tied between this one and then the 2nd book, The Dream Thieves, as my favorite, and I can never pick a favorite, but I really enjoy Blue Lily Lily Blue. The book takes an interesting twist kind of towards the end of the book as we kind of really get more into the plot of trying to find the Welsh king. I think the strongest point of this series is truly the character work of the 5 main characters. You truly do feel like you know them in and out, and you've been with them for this entire journey, and you just want to love them and you want the best things for them. There's something magical and whimsical about this series that I can't even put into words how much that it really means to me. The ending of this book is really fascinating, and I'm so excited to continue on with my read of the series, hopefully in March. The next book I read this month was another DNF, and that was Stormbreaker by Anthony Horowitz, I think it is, which is the first book in the Alex Rider series. So, if I'm being honest, I didn't give this book totally a fair shot. I think I read like 20 pages before I was just like, nope, this is not doing it for me. So from what I gathered, this book is about Alex Rider, who is basically recruited to be part of a British spy intelligence. And from that stems a lot of my problems. It's just completely unrealistic how this kid is randomly recruited. And also, this kid is 14 years old, and he's just getting himself out of near-death experiences right and left. And that's just in the first 20 pages I read. Another thing that I noticed within the first 20 pages was none of the characters had any personalities. They had no emotions. Like on the first page of the book, we find out that Alex's uncle, who basically raised him, is dead, and Alex is just like, cool, okay, yeah, that kind of sucks. And he like just doesn't portray any emotion towards it. None of the characters we meet have any emotion, and I just decided, you know what? I'm not going to do this to myself. We're just putting this down. I'll stick with the TV show. Next up was another book that I really loved, and that was Warcross by Mary Lou. So Warcross is set in a futuristic society where pretty much everyone is addicted to this virtual reality game called Warcross, which is basically virtual reality capture the flag. We follow our main character, Amika, who is a bounty hunter in New York City, and one day accidentally glitches herself into like the big championships of Warcross. Immediately she's accepted to like be come after by the creator of the game, but instead she's been asked to join the game as an undercover player to discover someone who's plotting to basically destroy Warcross, and pretty much goes from there. I'm surprised at how much I really enjoyed this book because I'm not necessarily a person who's very into video games or virtual reality, but I really didn't mind the parts of the books that focused on like the game aspect. I thought it was actually really interesting. I always find it really interesting reading books that are like set in like the near future and seeing where authors think society is going to go. And I think this was definitely an interesting take on it because it's not totally different than today's society, but there are its obvious differences in ways society has kind of had its downfall. The book was definitely super fast-paced, and that really kept me engaged and moving through the book. As I said before, the action scenes kind of in Warcross were super interesting and super engaging. Another thing I think the book did really well was the characters. Amika is put on a Warcross team with 4 or 5 maybe other players, and we really got to know all of them, and I think they were really additions to the story. Another main character we follow is actually the creator of the Warcross games, who kind of works with Amelia to discover this person, and they grow close throughout the book, and kind of seeing their relationship and his character specifically develop is very interesting. Now the plot twist at the end, probably most people would guess it. It's not exactly a crazy, wild, new, inventive plot twist, but I'm not good at guessing plot twists, so I was like blown away by it and like, wow, I can't believe that happened, and it definitely leads me really exciting to move into the sequel. But I haven't heard as great things about it, so I am a bit apprehensive. And I gave Warcross 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Inheritance Game by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and wow, did I really enjoy this book. So I didn't necessarily go into it thinking I wasn't going to enjoy it, but I thought it was probably just going to be a quick, nice read that I enjoyed, didn't think too much of, but that's not what happened. So in this book we follow Avery, I forget her last name, who's kind of just an average girl. She's on the poorer side, and she lives a fine life, but it's not like great by any means. Her mom's dead and her dad's missing, so she lives with her sister. And basically one day she finds out that this billionaire, who she does not know, has died, and he's left his inheritance to her, except for this one catch, that she has to go and live in the mansion with all of his relatives, including his 4 teenage boys. Now, these boys do not necessarily like Avery because their inheritance has been ripped away from them, and specifically kind of follow 2 boys, Grayson and Jameson. Grayson thinks Avery is a gold digger who's after their grandfather's money, while Jameson thinks Avery is just a piece in their grandfather's final game. So the book really does focus on them trying to figure out why the inheritance was left to Avery, because she doesn't know this man. She's never met this family before in their life. It was a really interesting premise, and I think Jennifer Lynn Barnes executed it perfectly. I certainly wasn't able to figure it out, and kind of at the end, you're left with a lot of questions, which then sets up for a sequel, and there is kind of a cliffhanger at the end with the youngest brother, and it makes me really excited. I think that the character work done in this book, again, was really good. I really enjoyed seeing Avery. I think she was a great main character, a really nice, really kind, caring person. And the 4 brothers I thought were developed nicely. I mean, we really do focus on 2 of them, Jameson and Grayson, who are kind of the closest to Avery, and obviously there's like romance in there, and like she likes both of them, kind of like which one will she end up with. But I think the brothers were all developed really nicely, and they're all really interesting characters, and I'll definitely be picking up the sequel when it comes out later this year. The ending of the book kind of made me go, oh, what, how, man, I can't believe that, I need the sequel, but it's not like out yet, so I do have to wait a few months, but definitely when it comes out I'll be picking it up. And I gave that book 4 stars. So the second to last book I read this month, my opinion on this book is very biased because it is by an author that I absolutely adore, and that is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. So I will admit I was a bit apprehensive going into this book, and I originally I was going to buy a copy of it like as soon as it came out, but I decided not to. Instead, just get a library copy of it as soon as I could from the library, so I'm like stalking the couple different like e-libraries I have access to, just waiting desperately, and then finally I was able to grab a copy of it, and then I read it in like just over a day. But I didn't want to buy a copy of it, and I was apprehensive. This is the 4th book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas, which I don't love, unfortunately. I think it's definitely her weakest series in terms of world building, and definitely by the end of the first 4 books, Reese and Pharaoh were really getting on my nerves, and I just didn't love them as much as everyone seems to. And so I was just like, I'm a bit apprehensive going into A Court of Silver Flames, especially because it follows Nesta, a character who I had very mixed feelings about throughout the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I absolutely despised her for the first 2 books, and in the 3rd book, A Court of Wings and Ruins, I grew to like her and have a lot of appreciation for her, and then something happened at the end of the book leading into kind of the novella that led me to not to like her as much, but I did have some hope for her. A Court of Silver Flames is the first book in kind of a second series set in the Akatar world. In this book specifically, we're following Nesta Archeron, who's Feyre's sisters, and Cassian, as Nesta is kind of dealing with the repercussions and trying to process everything that happened at the end of the original trilogy, and she is sent to train with Cassian at the Illyrian war camps, and that is all I'm going to tell you because anything else would completely spoil the first act. I have to commend Sarah J. Maas because by the end of this book, I loved Nesta. The character work Sarah J. Maas uses in this book, showing us Nesta's trauma and like her emotions and how she's dealing with everything, and how she truly does have this feeling of self-hatred towards herself, and then showing as she grows through this, works through these barriers, and eventually does really become a better person and get a lot better, I think was really good. You'd see Nesta constantly trying throughout this book to try to overcome her past, be a better person, and she fails multiple times, which I think is very realistic. Cassian, he was one of my favorite characters from the original trilogy, and he just continued being through that. A lot of times he's just like this goofy guy, but in Court of Silver Flames, we really do see a lot of like the darker side of him as like kind of what he dealt with as a kid with his mother and his growing up situation, and I thought that was a really nice touch. And I mean, I have to say, the romance in this book, Sarah J. Maas knows how to write a romance, and that is all I'm going to say on that front. And then finally, the plot of the book I thought was also really good. I'm not going to go into like too much with what happens, but it's kind of dealing with the end of the third book and the end of the war and kind of continuing as to, okay, where we go now. Something I thought that was really interesting is in this book there's a lot of talk about kind of the more ancient world and some older things and some of like the older groups, which I think was really good, working on the world building of the series, which I did not love throughout the first 3 books, and I'm excited we're getting more. And I really did love this book, but I do have to say, when it comes to Sarah J. Maas, I'm not the best at finding flaws in these books, because these are just books that I know I'm going to love. I'm going to them excited and just ready to devour them. Like I said, I read this book in like 36 hours, maybe, probably not even that, and I was in love with it. I don't recommend Sarah J. Maas books to everyone, because no, not everyone's going to like them. There are many people who absolutely hate them, but for me, I love them and they stick with me. The final book I read was technically a book I finished on March 1st, but I am counting it for February because that was The Picture of Dorian Gray, and that was the classic I was supposed to read in February. I did give myself a few days in March, so I was like, okay, you can finish this book like the first 3 days of March, because I like lost 3 days last month where I was just recovering from getting my wisdom teeth out and did not want to read a classic, but I did finish it the first day of March, so we're all good. So The Picture of Dorian Gray, we follow Dorian Gray, who's this young man, and he basically has this painting that's made of him, and it basically leads him to make a wish that he will never grow old and this painting will age instead of him. We follow him throughout the years as he kind of descends into evilness, and like the painting ages and like shows all of his sins and while he stays young and pretty. And I don't have a whole lot to say about this book, if I'm being honest. I think I gave it like 3.5 stars. It was fine, I liked it, but some parts of it I just felt like were really unnecessarily long and just lots of rambles, and I was like, okay, I don't understand this though. Another thing is, none of the characters in this book are likable, and while I don't hate unlikable characters, some of them do need to have some redeeming arc, and most of them absolutely did not. I think the thing I struggled with throughout this book was I couldn't figure out if Oscar Wilde was trying to critique something or was just writing a fun story. I think upon reflection it was satire more, like a critique, but I'm still not 100% sure. I struggled to get through the first 70 or so pages because it really does take a bit for kind of the more plot to kick in, but even then there's not a lot of plot. I did like some of the stuff that happened towards the end, and I thought it was fine. I don't have too many emotions or feelings about it, mostly just confusion. Something I do quickly want to mention is originally I talked about how with my goal to read a classic each month, I was planning on putting individual reviews of each book on my channel. I am no longer going to do that, so I'll just review them in my wrap up, but I'm still fully sticking to that plan. And because I'm not going to be putting up a March TBR just because of how we're already into March, I did just want to mention that the classic I will be reading in March is Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery, and I'll talk about this more, including a synopsis, in my March wrap-up. So there we go, that's what I read in February. I'm hoping to have a bit of a better reading month in March, hopefully read some more books, don't DNF really, hopefully get out of that 3.5 star range and get more into the 4 or 5 star range, which is obviously where you want to be because you want to be reading books you want to enjoy. But that's all for today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!